Iran's nuclear journey began not with confrontation, but with cooperation. In the 1950s, under the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran was a key ally of the West in the Middle East. The country's first steps into the atomic age were guided by the United States. This was actually part of President Dwight D. Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. The initiative aimed to share peaceful nuclear technology with allied nations. The United States provided Iran with its first research reactor in 1967, which was located at the Tehran Nuclear Research Center. The goal, as publicly stated, was to prepare Iran for a future powered by clean nuclear energy, reducing its reliance on its own vast oil reserves for domestic power generation. The ambition of the Shah's government was, well, significant. By the 1970s, Iran had laid out a grand plan to build over 20 nuclear power plants across the country. This was seen as a symbol of modernization and technological prowess. To achieve this, Iran signed contracts with companies from Germany and France. The United States also agreed to provide Iran with nuclear fuel and technology. During this period, Iran signed and ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, in 1970. This committed the country to not developing nuclear weapons. The international community, led by the United States, largely supported Iran's program, viewing it as a legitimate pursuit of civilian energy under a friendly regime. The roles of other global powers were also taking shape. The Soviet Union, a geopolitical rival to the United States, had a more cautious relationship with the Shah's Iran. It was not a primary partner in Iran's nuclear development at this stage. China was still in a period of relative international isolation and was not a significant player in Middle Eastern nuclear politics. India, which was developing its own nuclear capabilities, conducted its first nuclear test in 1974. This event, termed a peaceful nuclear explosion, raised global awareness about the potential for civilian programs to be diverted for military purposes. Israel, meanwhile, watched its neighbors' growing technological ambitions with a degree of concern. Though its primary focus was on more immediate threats from Arab states, everything changed in 1979. The Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah and established the Islamic Republic. The new government, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, was deeply suspicious of the West. It initially halted the nuclear program, viewing it as a symbol of the Shah's dependence on Western powers. Many foreign technicians and scientists left the country. This brought the once promising program to an abrupt and near-total standstill. The revolutionary government's anti-American stance fundamentally altered the way the world, and especially the United States, viewed Iran's intentions. The era of open cooperation was over, setting the stage for decades of suspicion and conflict over the very same program the West had once helped to build. Following the 1979 revolution, Iran's nuclear program entered a phase of dormancy. However, the long and brutal Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988, changed the strategic thinking in Tehran. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, had its own nuclear ambitions, which were famously targeted by an Israeli airstrike on the Osirak reactor in 1981. Witnessing Iraq's pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, and feeling vulnerable, Iran's leaders quietly decided to restart their nuclear program. This time, however, it would not be with the help of Western partners. The program was revived covertly, away from the prying eyes of international inspectors and foreign intelligence agencies. With Western assistance no longer an option, Iran turned elsewhere for help. Russia, emerging from the collapse of the Soviet Union, became a key partner. In 1995, Russia signed a contract to complete the construction of the Bushehr nuclear power plant, a project started by German companies before the revolution. This provided Iran with a significant technological and infrastructural boost. China also became an important supplier. It provided Iran with several technologies, including calutrons and a research reactor, during the 1980s and early 1990s. This assistance was crucial for Iran to rebuild its scientific and technical base after the post-revolution exodus of experts. The United States, now viewing Iran as a primary adversary, worked to isolate the program. It imposed sanctions and pressured both Russia and China to halt their nuclear cooperation with Tehran. The United States argued that even civilian assistance could help Iran gain the knowledge and materials needed for a weapons program. Under American pressure, China eventually agreed in 1997 to stop its official nuclear assistance to Iran. Russia, however, maintained that its work on the Bushehr plant was purely for civilian energy and was being conducted under the safeguards of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA. This created a point of friction between Washington and Moscow. During this period of renewed activity, Israel's concern grew exponentially. Israeli intelligence agencies began to closely monitor Iran's progress. They viewed an Iranian nuclear weapon as an existential threat. Unlike the United States, which focused on diplomacy and sanctions, Israel began to consider more direct actions. It viewed Iran's dispersed and secret facilities as much harder to neutralize than Iraq's single Osirak reactor had been. India, while maintaining diplomatic and economic ties with Iran, adopted a policy of cautious neutrality on the nuclear issue. It advocated for Iran's rights under the NPT, but also called for transparency and compliance with international obligations, reflecting its own delicate position as a nuclear power outside the NPT. The secretive nature of Iran's program was shattered in 2002. An Iranian opposition group, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, or NCRI, held a press conference revealing the existence of two previously undisclosed nuclear facilities, a uranium enrichment plant at Natanz, and a heavy water production plant at Arak. These revelations were a shock to the international community. Uranium enrichment can be used to produce fuel for power plants, but it can also be used to produce highly enriched uranium for nuclear bombs. Heavy water reactors can be used to produce plutonium, another path to a weapon. The discovery confirmed the worst fears of the United States and Israel, and triggered a major international crisis. The United States, under President George W. Bush, adopted a hardline stance. In his 2002 State of the Union address, he famously labeled Iran as part of an axis of evil. The United States pushed for the issue to be referred to the United Nations Security Council for punitive sanctions. Washington viewed Iran's secrecy as definitive proof of a weapons program and advocated for a policy of maximum pressure to dismantle it. The American invasion of Iraq in 2003, partly justified by concerns over weapons of mass destruction, loomed large in the background. This military action sent a powerful, if ambiguous, message to Tehran about American intentions in the region. In contrast to the American approach, European powers, primarily the United Kingdom, France and Germany, also known as the E3, favored diplomacy. They began a long series of negotiations with Iran, aiming to find a solution that would provide assurances about the peaceful nature of the program, while acknowledging Iran's right to nuclear technology. Russia and China supported this diplomatic track. They opposed the use of harsh sanctions or military threats, arguing that engagement was more productive. Both countries had significant economic interests in Iran, including energy and arms sales, and sought to maintain regional stability. They used their positions on the United Nations Security Council to moderate the severity of sanctions proposed by the United States. Israel, feeling the threat most acutely, pursued a multi-pronged strategy. It engaged in intense diplomatic efforts to persuade the United States and other nations to take a harder line. At the same time, it ramped up its covert operations. This period saw a series of mysterious cyber attacks and assassinations targeting Iranian nuclear scientists. The most famous of these was the Stuxnet computer worm, widely believed to be a joint American-Israeli project, which caused significant damage to the centrifuges at Natanz. Israel's actions demonstrated its low tolerance for risk and its willingness to act unilaterally to slow down the Iranian program, adding another volatile element to the escalating crisis. Years of sanctions and tense negotiations eventually culminated in a landmark diplomatic achievement. In 2015, Iran and a group of world powers known as the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which are the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, plus Germany, signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. This complex agreement was designed to verifiably prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. In exchange for significant long-term restrictions on its nuclear program, Iran would receive relief from the crippling international sanctions that had damaged its economy. Key restrictions included capping uranium enrichment levels, reducing Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium, and allowing for an intrusive inspections regime by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The United States under President Barack Obama was the primary architect and driver of the JCPOA. The Obama administration saw the deal as the best way to resolve the nuclear crisis without resorting to military conflict. It was honestly a cornerstone of his foreign policy. Russia and China were also strong supporters of the agreement. For them, the JCPOA not only resolved a major security concern, but also opened up Iran for business and investment. It stabilized the region and reinforced the principle of resolving disputes through multilateral diplomacy rather than unilateral force. India also welcomed the deal, since the easing of sanctions allowed it to resume purchasing Iranian oil and invest in projects like the Chabahar port. Israel, however, was the most vocal and powerful opponent of the JCPOA. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu argued passionately that the deal was a historic mistake. He believed the so-called sunset clauses, which allowed certain restrictions to expire over time, would pave a legitimate path for Iran to eventually develop nuclear weapons. He also argued that the sanctions relief would fund Iran's malign activities across the Middle East. Israel's government lobbied intensely in the United States Congress to block the deal, creating significant friction with the Obama administration. For Israel, the agreement did not solve the problem but merely delayed it, while strengthening its primary adversary in the process. The consensus behind the JCPOA proved fragile. In 2018, US President Donald Trump fulfilled a campaign promise by unilaterally withdrawing the United States from the agreement. He called it, quote, the worst deal ever, and reimposed harsh sanctions under a so-called maximum pressure campaign. This decision shattered the diplomatic framework. The other signatories, including the European powers Russia and China, tried to keep the deal alive, but the power of US secondary sanctions made it nearly impossible for them to deliver the promised economic benefits to Iran. In response, Iran began to incrementally breach the limits set by the JCPOA, restarting advanced centrifuge work and increasing its stockpile of enriched uranium, pushing the program far beyond the deal's constraints. As of today, June 22, 2025, the situation surrounding Iran's nuclear program is more precarious than ever. Following the US withdrawal from the JCPOA, Iran has significantly advanced its nuclear capabilities. It has enriched uranium to levels approaching weapons grade, expanded its fleet of advanced centrifuges, and reduced its cooperation with IAEA inspectors. While Iranian leaders continue to state that they are not seeking a nuclear weapon, their technical progress has drastically shortened the so-called breakout time, meaning the time it would take to produce enough fissile material for a bomb. This has created a new and more dangerous reality for all parties involved, leaving the world with fewer and honestly, less effective options. The roles of the major global powers have solidified in this new context. The United States, under its current administration, has publicly stated a desire to return to a diplomatic solution. But talks to revive the JCPOA or negotiate a new agreement have stalled. Deep mistrust on both sides, coupled with Iran's expanded program and regional activities, has made finding common ground extremely difficult. The US continues to maintain a strong sanctions regime while keeping the military option on the table as a last resort. This dual approach of pressure and professed openness to diplomacy defines the current American stance, creating a state of, well, perpetual tension. Russia and China have drawn closer to Iran, united in their opposition to what they see as US unilateralism. They have helped Iran weather the storm of American sanctions by providing economic and diplomatic support. Both nations continue to advocate for a return to the JCPOA as the only viable path forward. They blame the US withdrawal for the current crisis and resist any further punitive measures at the UN Security Council. Their support provides Tehran with a crucial lifeline, reducing its isolation and complicating Western efforts to apply pressure. This has led to a more polarized geopolitical landscape, with the nuclear issue becoming entangled in the broader strategic competition between the United States and the Russia-China axis. Looking ahead, the future is deeply uncertain. One path involves a successful revival of diplomacy, leading to a new, potentially stronger agreement that addresses the concerns of all sides. Another path is a continued escalation, where Iran's program advances to a point that triggers military action from Israel or the United States, with catastrophic consequences for the region. A third possibility is a state of limbo, where Iran exists as a nuclear threshold state, possessing the capability to build a weapon quickly, but choosing not to, creating a tense and unstable new normal. The decisions made in Washington, Tehran, Jerusalem, Moscow, and Beijing will ultimately determine which of these futures comes to pass.